We are at the end of a day of a meeting of the Advisory Council of the Women's Learning Partnership, concentrating on women and leadership. And tonight we're going to be sharing with you some of the ideas that came up in this meeting today, as well as some of the concepts and complexities that we have been dealing with for many years as women involved in women's NGO activism and issues related to women. Now, as we get together here at this particular time, at the end of a century and the beginning of another one, we're facing some challenges and we're facing some opportunities. The challenges that we face are that at the end of this century, we are facing a world which is quite uneven in terms of distribution of power and resources and all the amenities that human beings seem to strive for. Just to look at a few indicators of this, we have a world in which we still have almost 1 billion people who are illiterate. We have a huge number of people, something like 700 million who live on less than $1 a day. We still have very large numbers of people who don't have access to the minimum requirements of a healthy life. And of course, on this side of the scale, we have participation of half of the population of the earth, which are women, at a very small percentage. We all know that, for instance, both in economic fields as well as political fields, women are highly outnumbered in leadership positions. We have something like 13% representation across the world average in legislative decision making. We have something like 7% in cabinet positions, and we have something like well, let me just give you an example of the 1,000 richest corporations in this country, in the United States, public corporations. 2 CEOs are women. These are just indicators. So we have on the one hand the challenges, and on the other hand the lack of representation of half of the population. So these are what we start with when we begin to discuss women's leadership. And of course, we've been discussing today that numbers are not our only concern. Numbers are not our only concern, and that if we were to reach equity in terms of number, or equality in terms of number, it will of course be helpful in qualitative changes as well. But we would like to go beyond the matter of equality in numbers. We would like to really examine seriously the kinds of leadership structures which have led to the kind of challenges that we meet with today. So what kinds of leadership options do we have, and what kinds of opportunities are there present for us today that we can work together, men and women, across all boundaries of class, of race, of ethnicity, and geographic distances, so that we can reach toward a kind of world that we hope to have in the 21st century. So that's the kind of issues that we've been discussing. And of course, the wonderful, very challenging speakers that we have here today will be addressing the issue of women's leadership from different angles and from different perspectives, and will share with you some of their own conceptualizations, as well as some of the discussions that we carried out today. We do, on the side of potentialities, we do want to, I think we did come to a conclusion that communication being the basis of egalitarian leadership, the new potential that the technology has offered us in recent times is something that we can count on in building dialogical, participatory, interconnected, consensus-building types of leadership, which we think are the basis for a happier, more egalitarian and just world. Now, first I want to, before I go on to introduce our distinguished panelists, I want to thank the organizations who are our collaborators, the Johns Hopkins, the SAIS Dialogue at Johns Hopkins, and also the Kevorkian Center at New York University, who have helped us and collaborated in organizing this event as well as the day's event. And I also want to say to those of you who expected Soraya Obaid to be facilitating this gathering, unfortunately she was not able to join us, and Soraya Obaid, who's now Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund, was very eager to be with us, and she sent her regrets, but unfortunately she was not able to join us. Hopefully we'll have her here on another occasion. So tonight, the speakers, the wonderful speakers that we have addressing this issue are, and I'm going to introduce all of them in the order that they will address this gathering, and then we'll go on to hear each speaker. The first participant is Aruna Rao, who is the President of Association for Women's Rights in Development, AWID. And she is an expert in institutional change. She has worked at various levels, both of scholarly and academic work, and also at NGO grassroots. She worked with one of the largest NGOs in the world, grassroots NGOs in the world. She headed a gender team for BRAC, the institution in Bangladesh, which is a rural development NGO. And she's currently beginning the process of formation of creation of a network for gender and institutional transformation. So she will be discussing issues of leadership within the context of institutional transformation. Then after Aruna, we will have Charlotte Bunch, who founded the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers. Charlotte is one of the leading advocates, international leaders of the human rights movement. It's hard to look back and to remember that before Charlotte began her great activist effort to coordinate a movement to put the idea that women's rights are human rights, that before that, very recent past we're talking about, this was sort of a very odd idea that women's rights are human rights, and she has actually led the movement to achieve that particular verbalization of rights. And of course she has for 8 years conducted institutes at Rutgers University that deal with training women leaders. And our next speaker and our token man is Kumi Naidu. One of the ideas that we're dealing with in terms of women's leadership is that we cannot look at women's leadership separate from men and from men's leadership, both in terms of devising new styles of leadership and also in order to get the assistance and support and cooperation of like-minded people, men and women, to transform the societies that we need to change in equitable ways. And Kumi has been a leader in this area, not only in terms of women's activism and the assistance that he's always given to activists in this field, but he has been an extraordinary leader of an organization called Civicus, which is a World Alliance for Citizen Participation. And it's a network of organizations, and he has also been one of an extraordinarily inspirational leaders for work against racism, and also for the activism that he had as a very young person in South Africa, where he continues to his efforts and his activism. And our last speaker, but not at all least, is Aisha Imam, Executive Director of the Nigeria-based organization, Baobab. Aisha is also a scholar, an academic, a writer of great depth and interest, and also an activist. This bridging of the scholarly academic with the activist has been something that we've looked to with great excitement, because a lot has been added to our experience from that bridging of experiences. Aisha works in the intersection between cultural, religious, and traditional beliefs and systems, and the connection of that to efforts to improve women's rights. And she works in Nigeria, of course, but she also works with the network of called Women Living Under Muslim Laws, which works in Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries. So without taking more of your time, I will ask our first speaker, Aruna Rao, to address the gathering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mehnaz, for this opportunity. I see a number of my colleagues, long-standing colleagues in the audience, and I hope that the kinds of issues that I'd like to raise and the challenges that I'd like to raise for us, I see them as coming from a collective body of work that many of us have been involved with, and I hope that they share these same challenges. I have been asked to really look at the whole question of leadership for institutional transformation, and I'd like to focus a little bit about what that means and then look at some challenges in that area. When we think about leadership for institutional transformation, I immediately think of three big questions. What kind of leadership will lead to institutional transformation? What is institutional transformation, and what is it all for? There are many ways in which we think about how change happens and how we make change happen. In a very simplistic way, you can think of it as happening at three levels. There's individual level change. A lot of us work on gender training, working on how to change people's attitudes, behaviors, how to build capacity of individuals to effect change in larger systems. Another way of thinking about that is changing organizations. Many of us in the community who have sort of gone from gender training or did gender training, a lot of gender training in the 80s and 90s have focused in the past, say, 10 years or so, a lot on organizations. There's been some very good theoretical work that looks at how the organizations we work in are in fact gendered or gender biased in very significant ways. And if you sort of take a snapshot of the past decade and say, what kinds of things have people focused on and sort of where are we in terms of organizational change for gender equality? You could point to gender parity, the notion that you need to have more women in the organization, the need to have more gender policies or gender equitable policies within the organization, the need to have guidelines for gender programming. These are all things that we've been able to achieve in organizations that are working for social change. And then if you move to the next level, it's this notion of institutional change. And how is that different from organizational change? Again, there is some very good writing to guide us on this. Many of us who've been working on these issues for many years feel that we have achieved a considerable amount, but there's this very deep level of resistance within organizations, within all kinds of organizations, not just formal organizations, whether they're public or private, but all kinds of other institutions, the market, the family, the state, that resist the change, that we've not been able to make very much change in the culture of these varieties of organizations. So that sort of has led us to thinking about what is institutional change, how does institutional change differ from organizational change, and how can we begin to look at that question. Institutional change really refers to this sort of partly hidden, this set of rules, values, principles, that are overlaid in many places everywhere with culture, with history, with the particular histories of organizations that form a kind of a value base or a foundation that can prevent in ways that are not very clear, that are not very obvious, that can prevent us in being able to pursue a gender equality agenda. So if we can think of this kind of work and what we've been doing, what I'd like to do is to just to throw out to you what I see as, and again, coming from this community of people involved in this work, some of the key challenges, some of the very difficult issues that we're grappling with, that we need to spend some energy and thought on. The first one is this, stemming from my last point, it's this question of how do you address deep structures of organizations? We know that women are voicing their invisibility in many ways. They're naming gender equality, and that leads to certain kinds of changes. But to challenge this deep structure of organizations, to challenge cultures, that's an obvious area where we've not made very much progress, although there are some very good examples around the world of people working on these issues and trying to sort of, whittle away at these very difficult concepts and living beings in organizations, and to try to research them, to try to examine them, to try to uncover them, and then to, hold up the mirror, if I can borrow a phrase from colleagues, to hold up a mirror to say, this is what it looks like, and is this what you want it to look like? Is this what you want? Is this what can help us achieve what we need to achieve? So there are good examples, but they're few and far between. I think another big challenge, we've just run a 2.5-month email conference on the questions of institutional change and how people think about it, and what kinds of interventions they're doing and what they see as future priorities. And one of the issues that became very clear is that the work on organizational change for gender equity in many contexts has become a kind of an enterprise in and of itself and for itself. It has become very focused on the organization itself and the people who live in this organization, and the discipline has become, or one can characterize the discipline as being couched in technical, non-political ways of thinking about it. So it's become, in a way, there are two dangers of that. One is that it becomes disconnected from the politics of the project. This isn't a neutral project. This is a project that has choices. This is an endeavor that has clear political choices. And some of the work, when we tend to focus too much on the inside of the organization, we forget the real nature of this work. And the other danger, of course, is that it becomes disconnected from the constituencies for which this work is aimed at. It becomes disconnected from women's lives. So that's a challenge. How do you reconnect to the political nature of this work, and how do you reconnect to constituencies for which this work is really the driving force? A third challenge that I see, and it's one that I was voicing earlier at our meeting today, was that when we focus on gender equality, that's our main slice, that's our lens when we look at organizational change or institutional change. Now, all of you know, who have worked in this field, all of you know that when you do that, when you begin to examine how does that lens help you to understand the nature of institutional frameworks in organizations and what needs to be changed, that it always brings to it, it's like a magnet, it always attracts to it other kinds of identities that are important signifiers of all of us, that also shape the nature of inequality and like caste, like class, like race, like ethnicity. Now, there's a kind of dilemma that we're in. On the one hand, if you don't find a way of analyzing those other signifiers, then your analysis is limited. Then your ability to identify what is the nature of the problem that needs to be changed is limited. However, I think it's not often when we do. I don't think we know how to do it well. But if we do bring in other kinds of inequalities that intersect with gender, because of the lack of clout of gender equality, the other signifiers take over and gender becomes lost. So I think we need a more, I don't know, it's a question. Do we need a more sophisticated way of putting these various cuts of the issue together in order to help us identify, in order to improve our practice? Or does that depth of analysis and that elegant statement of an issue or problem, will that stymie our action? Now, the fourth challenge is about power. I mean, leadership, institutional change, all of this is a very significant piece of this is understanding and changing power. And I think the place that we are at and the challenge for us is that, on the one hand, we understand very clearly that hierarchical power, exclusionary power, has resulted in effects that we want to change. We want to change the exercise of power. But in that process, it's not a question of, describing one model of power and then saying, the other model of power, or the quote-unquote feminist model of power, is XYZ. It's different from the model A. It's more inclusive, it's more participatory, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think the challenge for us is to understand. It's not just to understand. I think we probably understand that power is very nuanced, but how do we communicate and how do we work with, in an institutional change process, a more nuanced understanding of power, wherein positional power, wherein all kinds of power have a role to play at different points in time. And clearly, a very big piece of that is power for what? It's, how does our exercise of power in fact result in the kinds of goals and social justice ends we care about? The fifth issue I just want to throw out to you is sort of taking institutional analysis to the next level. I think one of the biggest challenges is, how does institutional change for gender equality and that thinking and that work, how does it link to broader development paradigms? I think we're at a place where at many fora we hear and we understand and we see that the kinds of development paradigms that have shaped resource distribution and institutional arrangements in the past are more obviously no longer adequate to the task. A lot of work now is focusing on the global infrastructure and how the global infrastructure, economic infrastructure, is taking away from the role of the nation state. Well, in fact, the nation state in many contexts, 1 minute, is the largest, the most significant oppressor of human rights. So it's not sort of one or the other. I think we have the ability and we have the opportunity now to think about how our ideas of institutional change for gender equality and power can in fact help to shape a new set of institutional arrangements at a global level. just want to end up with information to you that there are many of us here who are part of an effort now to launch an initiative that will bring together scholars, practitioners, policymakers who work on and who are interested in the issue of gender and institutional change. And I think it's something that I would encourage you to be part of. I think this whole field needs to broaden, and we need to be able to create learning communities around the world who can build knowledge and who can share experience. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in it, to let me know or let others know in this room who are involved in it, and we'd love to have you involved. Thank you.
Well, Aruna's a hard act to follow, but I've learned over the years that it seems to me to get harder and harder to talk about leadership in the abstract, because the more you work on it, the more complicated you realize it is, and I share Aruna's sense of those challenges. I also want to say, before I say things abstractly, that I actually think we learn the most about leadership in a very concrete and contextual way. That leadership is, in fact, contextual. It doesn't happen in the abstract. It happens in specific places and times and around particular goals. And that what we really need to do to see what we want from women's leadership is to get clear what are those goals that we have for women's leadership, and to talk about how one advances those in each particular setting and each particular time. And so what I want to talk about are some kind of broad questions that I think help when you begin to look at any particular context that you're working in, whether it's local or global, and try to work on women's leadership. So following Aruna, I will also try to talk about three questions within that. One is, what do we mean by women's leadership? The second is, what difference does it make? And the third is, how do we bring more women's leadership into the public policy arena, particularly at the global level? Starting with the work that we do at the Center for Women's Global Leadership, when we started, we realized that we also had to be clear, leadership for what? Leadership for what? What kind of goal did we want women to be addressing? And so we see our work as being very much in the framework of leadership for values that look at human rights, economic justice, feminism, how women could bring those kinds of values into the public arena. And we also said that we wanted to look at both the leadership women take every day in their local lives, and how that leadership could inform the global arena, and how women could use the global institutions in their local work. And secondly, the other way around, how do you bring the voices of women locally into the global arena? Because when we looked at the United Nations and human rights institutions and so forth, it seemed to us that although there were often many women leading locally, that when you move into the international circles, that there were very few women. And recently, when the UN had its Millennium Summit, some of you may have seen the front cover page in the New York Times of the 180-some leaders of the world nations, and about a handful of women within that was sort of symbolic of where we were not. But specifically, when I'm talking about women's leadership, I want to start by saying that we didn't invent women's leadership. It's not something that any of us on the panel created. Women's leadership has been happening for a long time, but it's often been invisible precisely because it has not been exercised in the traditional male models. Most of women's leadership has taken place in the family, the community, the private sphere. And therefore, much of what I think we can build on, which is the experience women have had leading in their own lives locally, has been invisible to those who are doing leadership studies and talking about what is leadership. So the first challenge that I think we have is to really look at the ways that women have been leading already, the ways that women have led in resolving conflicts and finding solutions to problems, the ways that women have led in pulling people together to make something happen, whether that's a water pump or a street lamp on the corner, the ways in which women have been leading in their families to stretch tight budgets and be able to make hard choices about how the family will survive on too little money and too little resources. The ways that women have organized, I think actually women have probably invented multitasking, a phrase that we have today. The ways that women have taken that leadership, often in very invisible but nonetheless powerful ways in their own families, communities. Now when I say that, I don't mean every woman in every family is a leader. Look at your own family, look at your own local community, and you will see who the people are who are taking the leadership. It's not every woman, it's not every man, but you will see over and over again that at the level of how we get things done in our daily lives, that women have been leading and probably have been leading in many places around the world for a long time. What I think is the challenge is to take what we've learned from that and to bring that into the public sphere, and to find ways that women who have had that experience and those skills can be part of the national and the international policymaking process. And I think that we need to do that because women's experience brings some new ideas to the table. And we need to do that also because I think that we couldn't do worse than what patriarchal leadership has done to the world in the last couple hundred years. And so it seems to me that we ought to try it, if for no other reason than just to see if we could get something different out of it. And I think also in talking about this kind of leadership, that even feminists, in our rejection of traditional male models of authoritarian leadership, have often lumped together all leadership, have reinforced the notion that that's real leadership, and haven't even ourselves reinforced the notion that there are other kinds of leadership that are already happening. So all the work that we do is not to create leaders or even to train leaders, as Manaz said it, but to bring out what we think is already happening, to strengthen it, to give it more voice, to make it more visible, to make it more public, to make it more powerful. Because I think leaders happen. I don't think we make them. I don't think you can make somebody be a leader. I think you can encourage, support, and strengthen the leadership that many, many women as well as men have the potential to take, and you can help give the support so that that leadership goes in the direction of the goals that we share. Now, that brings me to the second question: what difference will it make? What values or changes do women leaders, or I should not say women leaders, I have to say pro-feminist women leaders or progressive women leaders with a vision for the kind of social change we talked about, bring? What does an attempt to bring a gender lens to leadership bring you? First of all, I think it brings us democracy. I mean, I think, first of all, we just have to put on the table very clearly that until more women are in leadership at all levels, we don't have effective democracy in any country in the world. And that, therefore, it is simply a matter of justice and democracy to bring women into the leadership arena. And I think that those countries from Scandinavia to Argentina to India, recently France, that have begun to accept this as part of the challenge of democracy are leading the way. I think the United States is very far behind in this, in leading the way and showing that it's simply a matter of making democracy effective, a reality to bring women into leadership. I think we also see that when that starts to happen, if you look at the experiments that have happened from India at the local community or from some of the studies of women in leadership in the United States at state level, state legislature level, you see that bringing women into formal leadership positions in large numbers, or what we call a critical mass of women, actually does bring some changes. It doesn't necessarily bring all the changes we want in terms of all the social justice values, but it does begin to undermine the concept of male domination in certain spheres and produce the possibility for new things to happen. And that is, in my view, where we start with democracy as representation, as bringing women in. But my argument is more than that. It's that the world needs to bring women into leadership because women have a different experience, not necessarily a biological argument. I don't think anybody knows. I don't even like to argue what's biology and what's not, because I don't think any of us know. We haven't been far enough away from social construction of gender roles to even know what would be natural and biological, if there is such a thing, and what would be socially constructed. But what we do know is that women have played different roles in their societies for many years, and therefore they have different views of problems. They have different solutions to offer. And this has been shown over and over again in the women in development field, that when you bring women into the discussion, you get different solutions. I think recently we've begun to see this in the women in peacekeeping field, that when you bring women into the peacekeeping efforts, you begin to get different options for solutions to the problems. So I think from the point of view of a world which is in bad need of new ideas, of new possibilities, new strategies, new solutions, that it's very important to bring all the different sectors of the population to the table. And women are one of those sectors. As Aruna has said very effectively, of course, women are not one generic thing. So that also means you have to bring a diversity of women to the table. You have to bring women from diverse experiences to the table as well if you want to create those solutions. Now, what are some of the values that we think that this type of process of bringing more women in could reinforce? Again, not because it's biological, but because at least in the studies that have been done so far, it shows that when you bring a lot of women into the process, you tend to get a more collective and cooperative style. Not total cooperation. Believe me, we all know about competition amongst women. We all know that women can fight as well as men can fight. But rather that women are used to working more in a process where you have to bring everybody into the solution or it doesn't work. So that the styles that women tend to have give more people a stake in the solution because they've given more people a voice in the process. And whether that's because they're women or not, it's, I think, a style that we want to encourage women and men to take more. Another thing that we see is the interface between public and private life in creating solutions. Again, women's situation has required that they see the relationship between the private sphere and the public sphere. So, for example, as women have sought solutions to problems like violence against women, they have become very clear that you can't have a single issue solution, that the solutions require looking at the interface between the domestic private sphere of violence and the public sphere of women's economic power or lack thereof, of housing crises, of other kinds of public policies that affect what women's options are. So that's the kinds of solutions that I think we're looking for, that understand public and private interface in what we must do. And finally, I think that we're looking for more inclusive strategies. Now, women are not necessarily more inclusive either, but because women have not had as long an investment in being in public power positions, we can at least hope that we can infuse a sense that if you've come from exclusion, that you should understand the need for inclusion. And I think none of this is inevitable, but I think if we work with strategies for bringing women into leadership and support these kinds of values in that process, and support the women who have those values, which is to say, support the women who move into leadership that represent the values we care about, not every woman just because she's a woman, and support the men who move into leadership who also exhibit these values, that we can begin to see some different options emerging. So finally, before Manaz gives me the high sign, I just want to say a couple of things about how we make this happen more. I think one of the problems at the international level, even in the UN, is that as women have begun to move more into leadership internationally, nationally, they're still stereotyped into certain fields. So you still see women primarily in health ministries. In the UN, you see women heads of UNICEF for children, women heads of population fund, women heading, well, finally, human rights. It's an interesting question whether human rights is considered a hard issue or a soft issue. Maybe that's in the nexus between the hard and the soft. But mostly still we see women in the so-called soft issues. Now, on the one hand, one of our goals is to say that these are important issues. And so the fact that women are there doesn't mean that we want to say they're less important. But if we really want to change the structures of society and meet the challenges that Aruna laid out, we also have to have more women dealing in defense and disarmament, globalization and trade, the so-called hard issues, and trying to figure out how the experiences that women have address these questions as well. And to do that, I think we have to change the paradigm of what people think it takes to be a leader around these areas. And when people ask me, why is the United States so reluctant to have a woman president? Well, I think one of the reasons is there is very deep-seated misogyny in the United States about the power of the presidency, and there is a very strong disbelief that a woman could exercise that kind of power. So I think we ought to talk about changing the power of the U.S. as well, but I also think we need to look at why is it that women are not seen as being capable of exercising power in those kinds of situations. Finally, I think the other thing that is happening in the world today that provides a context for moving more women into global leadership is that all of the crises of the last 10 or 15 years accompanying globalization, accompanying women, accompanying wars and conflicts, has actually, I think, opened up space, very contested space, where all the old certainties about what should be done are really falling away, and the need for new solutions is much clearer. So in a way, that's the crisis that creates an opportunity for women's leadership and women with these values to move into that. And I think one of the challenges that I would add to Aruna's list is when we have seen women successfully, or women and men successfully leading in more cooperative ways at the local level, it's often very difficult to make that work succeed in the face of state power, succeed in the face of backlash. And so one of the challenges we have is how do we keep these values and at the same time take on those very powerful and dominating institutions that are controlling our lives without losing those values. And I think that I will leave it with that challenge. Thank you.
Good evening. It's even worse for me, Charlotte, to follow Aruna and you. A 60-year-old feminist woke up in the middle of the night in San Francisco and found God in a room. And God said to her, "You've served the women's movement so well. You probably have another 20 years of activism left in you. I want to give you one wish that you really want so that you can enjoy the next 20 years of activism." So she looked up and she said, "One wish?" And she said, "Yes, that's God." God said. And she said, "Can you please build a bridge from San Francisco to Hawaii?" And so God said, "Do you understand the environmental implications of that? It'll be really, that was really way beyond my scope." And so he said, "Can't you think of something else?" And the feminist said to God, "Well, could you help me understand masculinity? Can you help me understand what will make men change, how we can get them to work with us to build a more just world? What do you think we can do to let them open access and to share power in equitable ways?" And God said, "How many lanes do you want on the highway?" I want to focus my comments on two questions. One is the challenge of building gender equity and how that relates to us ensuring that today we connect work that is happening at different levels. And there are two particular cases that I want to look at. The first case is how do we connect work that is happening locally, nationally, and globally in terms of promoting gender equity as well as promoting specifically the issues of leadership. As many of you know, in the 1980s, there emerged a slogan, "Think globally, act locally." The idea behind that was that in trying to advance struggles for social justice, and in our case, gender equity at a local level, we needed to understand how global processes were having an impact on your local reality, because if you did not do that, it would be a strategic error because you would miss out some possibilities and opportunities for change at a local level. By the 1990s, given the way power in the world had changed, with so much power shifting from the national level to global level, that an organization like DAWN, Development Alternatives for Women in a New Era, began to say, hang on a minute, if we think globally and we act solely locally, that means in fact we are shutting ourselves out of where power increasingly is residing. So the slogan had to be sort of turned upside down as well, because you needed to also think locally and where appropriate, also act globally because more and more real choices about the lives people make were being made by powerful institutions far away from them. When we look at the question of gender equity, today I would argue that in this context of globalization, that when we talk about there often being more losers than winners, increasingly when we look at the gender dimension of that, it is very clear that women often are the ones that are on the receiving end of some of the most adverse outputs of globalization. So in terms of responding to the challenge of building leadership to meet the challenge of globalization generally, or specifically the challenge of gender equity, those of us who are committed to this kind of work need to look at how we connect these different levels of work. The second connection that needs to be made is how we connect what we might call micro-interventions, meso-interventions, and macro-interventions. By micro interventions, I mean the commendable efforts that are made by millions of grassroots, local institutions working around promoting specific programs that seek to enhance the quality of life of women. This could be from women's organizations working around trying to provide AZT for women living with HIV/AIDS, or women who are working around providing shelters for survivors of domestic violence. Now, when we look at that piece, there are distinctive leadership challenges that actually confront us. The set of leadership skills that are needed for that set of work, some of it is distinctive, but as you'll see later, I would argue that some of those skills are transferable to the other levels as well. When we look at the meso level, the middle level if you want, it's what you might call the area of activism for incremental policy changes. And given that today is the election in Britain for a new government, let me remind you that in whenever the last elections was, I can't remember, 5 years ago I think, in Britain, 2 days after the election, Tony Blair stood up with a very large number of Labour Party MPs who were women, and the press unfortunately derisively carried the story as Tony Blair's babes. Today, in this election, 5 years after that movement forward, there was significantly less number of candidates who ran for elections. And if you ask ourselves why there is a reverse when there was 5 years ago this positive movement forward, the answers range from the ridiculous to the sublime. On the one hand, it's as simple as issues of toilets in some countries. When you look at parliaments and how many toilets there are for women parliamentarians, toilets might be culturally specific, restrooms, washrooms, bathrooms, whatever works for you, lavatories. From the male institutional culture that these institutions still have, make it very difficult for people getting access through lots of very difficult additional effort quite often. The childcare facilities in these institutions is another issue, which make it very difficult for managing and contributing to what we can call incremental policy changes. Why I call them incremental policy changes is for this reason. I think that getting access to policy-making institutions at a local, national, and even a global level is only part of promoting the agenda of women's leadership. Because we have to assume that those institutions themselves require not simply minor reforms, but require what's the third level of intervention, which we could call the macro level, substantive policy changes. And if I were to take an example at a global level, if we were to make Manaz tomorrow the president of the IMF, I suspect, much as I like Manaz, not much will change. Because the governance of the IMF is fundamentally a $1 one vote system. It is premised on the dominance of those who have money and capital, and it makes it very difficult, really, for even a well-meaning person in leadership of any of those institutions to have the kind of fundamental transformation that needs to be made. Now, what I'm suggesting is that all three levels of intervention are important, are critical, are necessary. We cannot dodge anything. So as I was saying earlier today, when we look at the Beijing processes, like the Beijing +5, all the meetings around that, and as I know some of you call it Beijing -5, but there were many complaints about how those processes were run and so on, but those are processes that are there. They have to be challenged. We have to try and push their agenda as much as we can. We have to try and assert equitable leadership as much as we can, but we have to do that with an acceptance that what we have in terms of the fundamental institutional framework needs to change. Now, Charlotte's comments about pushing the democracy agenda is absolutely right. We need to, though, as part of that, also ask ourselves, do we have a level playing field in this democracy scenario today? We also need to interrogate deeply at the national level about the accessibility of these institutions in terms of people even getting elected. The United States, supposedly an exporter of democracy, there are only three types of people, I think, as an observer, and I take my chance here as a South African to say this, given so many people during the liberation struggle from the United States came to South Africa for 2 weeks and were able to help us solve all our problems, or had the solutions for all our problems. So I say this somewhat hesitantly. But in the US today, I would argue that there's three types of people who have access to national political leadership: the rich, the extremely rich, and the obscenely rich. And if we look at where resources are located in terms of being able to even seek elected office, the threshold for women is much, much more difficult. There is no question about it. I know of somebody who ran for a seat on the Los Angeles Education Board and had to invest $200,000 to run for that seat. So all three levels have to be engaged, and we have to try to understand how we interconnect each of those three levels, and we also have to work out how we give integrity and meaning to the people who are working at all three levels, and how we can be allies rather than competitors across those three levels. The second substantive point I want to make is a challenge to us involved in this field, and that is we have to say to ourselves that we have a challenge to broaden the constituency for this work. It is just not good enough for us to come back again 2 years from now, have another conference like this, look around and find, in fact, more or less the same people are still here and they've been around several times. And the challenge of broadening the constituency and mainstreaming this work, I think, is one of the most important challenges that we face. We need to also recognize that some of the interventions that have been made have served to ghettoize the work around gender equity and women's leadership, even from progressive organizations. If I were to look at my own background within the ANC, when we set up an ANC Women's League, we sort of said, oh, the ANC Women's League, they'll take care of all the gender issues so we can continue and do our, the other serious stuff. And if you look at student movements in many parts of the world, if you're thinking institutions, even student movements, when they set up a women's division, what it serves to do is more to ghettoize and kind of compartmentalize the problem rather than make the agenda of gender equity a fundamental, indispensable part of building democratic practice. So for that reason, I think, as part of the strategy of developing a broader constituency for gender justice work, is what I call developing a discourse of outrage. And that is, we have to say that it's, for example, that it's not good enough, for example, a country like the United States, which has such a long tradition of formal democracy, that it cannot deliver a president. That it's just not good enough that when there's a photograph taken like the one Charlotte mentioned, that there's so few people there. It's not good enough when NATO takes the 50th anniversary photograph just nearby. Yeah, if we ran a competition, spot the woman in the photograph, I could have offered a $1 billion prize and nobody could even apply for it. And the Charlotte's point around linking it to democracy is fundamentally, I think, the right thing to do. The other thing that we need to do, I got my looks from Manas, so I'm rounding up, is beginning to work with men. And I want to say that this is a controversial issue. In my own work in South Africa working around mobilizing men around issues of violence against women and children, when the idea was first raised by some of us, it caused shock. People said, oh, y'all are promise keepers. And to be honest, I never heard of promise keepers. And then I've had to do some research, and now I've understood who they are since I've been here. But right now, we have to, if we take an issue like violence against women and children, we have to recognize that men are the perpetrators of the problem. And even if we run the best shelters, even if we provide the best counseling, all of which we need to do much more about, if we think about it, all our resources are going into dealing with the symptom of the problem. We have to look at what needs to be done to challenge the way male consciousness is developed and look at working with men in a much more dynamic way. Of course, central to this has to be a partnership between progressive men and progressive women working together. Religious leaders need to be challenged, business leaders need to be challenged, political leaders need to be challenged in fundamental and substantive ways. I've run out of time. Thank you very much. Sorry, guys.
Hi, everybody. Well, Kumi thought he had it bad speaking after Aruna and Charlotte, and I get to speak after Aruna and Charlotte and Kumi. This is really unfair. To me falls the task that I approach with some trepidation, but also a good deal of pleasure of talking about one pretty small experiment in developing women's leadership. And that's a project, that's a collaborative project between the Women's Learning Partnership, which is represented by Manaz here, and the Democratic Association of Moroccan Women. Amina, you want to stand up for a second? Lève-toi. Which Amina is representing at the moment, and thank you. And the Women's Technical Affairs Committee of Palestine, which unfortunately could not come to the meeting today, and Baobab for Women's Human Rights, which is a Nigerian-based women's human rights organization, which I'm representing here. And I want to talk a little bit about the process of developing that, and then a little bit more about pilot testing it specifically in Nigeria, because, as Charlotte said, when we're talking about these things, in effect, you have to talk about the concrete. And for me, the specific concrete I work with is Nigeria. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we've identified from looking at what we've been doing in the course of the meeting that we've had today. So first of all, it should be clear that I'm talking about what has been a fairly long collaborative process, but also that I'm doing it from my particular and personal perspective. Okay.